Okay. Thank you for joining us today for our book event webinar. Today's topic will be Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People, an autobiography by a hero for many around the world, Natan Sharansky, and Dr. Gil Troy, a great friend of Jinsa's. Their new book is an autobiography that details Mr. Sharansky's years in prison, how it prepared him for a very public life after his release. Natan Sharansky is currently chairman of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And Dr. Gil Troy is a distinguished scholar at McGill University. He's an award-winning presidential historian and noted author. This interview will be moderated by Jinsa President and CEO, Dr. Michael Makovsky. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen, or you may also ask questions by raising the hand feature in Zoom. For those in the audience, you're automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Dr. Makovsky to start this discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Aris. Thank you all for joining. Most importantly, we're really honored to have Natan Sharansky join us today, and Gil Troy. And I don't think Natan really needs any introduction, but I'll just add my own. You know, I think when you think about Jews today in the world, I can't think of a more eminent and respected Jew than we have in Natan Sharansky, and it's really terrific to have him here today. And on a personal note, I find him, cracks aside, that he's just as good a person, in person as he is by reputation. So it's great to have him. And I'll say with Gil, as someone, we got our PhDs, I think, from the same department. And Gil actually writes books, is a historian who actually writes books that people read. And he's also a great guy, as is his brother Tevi and his family, and it's great to have him here today as well. So I'm going to ask, first of all, the discussion of the purpose of the book is, of this Zoom, is to discuss this book, Never Alone. And for those of you who don't have it yet, I strongly encourage you to buy it. And for those of you who have it, I strongly encourage you to read it, because it is really interesting, very compelling. It is not a typical book that people associate with. Well, we'll ask them how they describe the book, but it's not what one associates normally with, let's say, autobiography. There's a lot of fascinating discussions about Natan's life and a lot of analysis about the Soviet Union, about prison life, about Israel, about Israeli politics, about politicians. Is just very rich, and it's frankly hard to put down. And I thought Natan's book, Fear No Evil, which I had the privilege of traveling with him a bit when he was when it first came out, I thought that was one of the best books I read. But I think this, certainly equals it and is really compelling. So I recommend. So we'll touch on some issues of the book and some other matters. So I'd like to start with you both, just a general question about the book, and then we'll get into some of the substantive issues. First, maybe, and I'll start with Natan and Gil, is how did you guys come to write this book? Why now? How did you guys come together to write this together?
Hello, Michael. Thank you for inviting us. And it's really great to see you after all these years. You mentioned when we, in the beginning of our connection, friendship, I really wrote book Fear No Evil. That was, I was just from prison, and I wanted to share experience of Soviet prison, of interrogations, of KGB, in order people who, God forbid, also are going to face it, Soviet Union still existed, will have my experience. But now this book, it's already after I was 9 years in prison, and I was 9 years in the government, and I was 9 years in Jewish Agency, which is like the biggest NGO presenting world Jewry to Israeli government. So I felt that when you look from these three different perspectives on relations between Jews and Israel, or on the big debate about nationalism and freedom, what goes first, can it go together? I find out that when you compare these three perspectives, you can come to very important conclusions, which look one-sided when you look only from one side, but I have an opportunity to look at from different sides. One thing is to look at the Jewish people from prison, when it is so important to feel connected to every Jew in the world and with hope that they are struggling for you and you know nothing about what's happening. Then to look at from Israeli government, which Israeli government tries to be the place for all the Jews of the world, and at the same time tries to mobilize Jews to defend it. And then from the perspective of world Jewry, which discovered that Israel is a great tool for their own strengths, their own identity. And everybody has their own interests, but how it goes together. So that's when I decided that to compare these three perspectives will be interesting. And then I hear very interesting and exciting historian of American history, at the same time Jewish activist, just now moved to Israel, Gil Troy. And so I thought it's a good idea to propose him to write this book together. Gil, you continue from here.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, good evening. I have to send special regards not only to you, Michael, and Hugh Harris, but to all the wonderful people from Ginza who joined us on a magical Friday night dinner out on our back porch a million years ago. It ended up in February, just before the craziness of the pandemic. And we look forward to having more Friday night dinners in Jerusalem with you and your wonderful organization. You know, as you mentioned, Michael, we're PhDs, academics. We were in the Harvard History Department. I was at the Harvard History Department, specifically when Natan was in the Gulag. That means that I don't get along with anybody. I just do my own thing. I never write with anybody. I just play in my own sandbox. And I wasn't looking for a partner because I just finished this book, The Zionist Ideas, and I was actually looking for someone to write the preface. So Natan and I had one of those meetings where I was asking him to write the preface for my book, The Zionist Ideas. He was asking me to be the co-author on his next project. And we figured out that we were somewhat speaking the wrong language. And then we put it all together and started working together. And I should emphasize, despite our very different backgrounds, and despite fighting over sequence and logic and wording and style, ideologically, we were on the same page. Ideologically, both of us are deeply committed to the notion of Jewish peoplehood. Ideologically, both of us are committed to this notion that Natan was saying, that we live in a world of either or. Are you liberal or national? A nationalist? Are you a universalist or a particularist? And we say, no, we're both. We're trying to thread the needle. We're trying to synthesize. And of course, we're also passionate supporters of the state of Israel and defenders of democracy. And so we could argue about little things here and there, but fundamentally on the big things, we were in concert. And indeed, Michael, we don't look at our book simply as a memoir. We call it either a manifestoir or a memoir festo. It's a manifesto and a memoir. We're using stories from Natan's life to tell about a bigger picture. And that gets to the key title. Originally, the working title, and we literally signed a book contract, 999, for the 9 years that Natan was talking about, 9 years in the Gulag, 9 years in Israeli politics, 9 years in the Jewish Agency, and that's the structure of the book. But I didn't like the title 999 because you can't have an inside joke as a title, and people wouldn't know what 999 was. I worried some of my Christian friends might think 666 and the devil. Some of my German friends might think 999 and we're being negative. And I'm sitting with a friend and we're brainstorming. He says, well, tell me about the book. I said, well, Natan Sharansky's in the Gulag for 9 years. And he's told by the KGB again and again, you're forgotten, you're abandoned, you're alone. And he says, I knew I was never alone. And my friend says, that's it. Yeah. For 75 years, the Jewish people have been saying, never again. And of course, we still honor the martyrs of Auschwitz and protect the memory of those who survived in the Holocaust. But you can't build a future just on never again. And never alone means that when you're part of this amazing network called the Jewish people, you're never alone. Somebody's got your back. Never alone means that when you're part of a democratic community, when you're an officer in the army, and if you're potentially taken prisoner, or if you're injured, you know you're never alone. And so our message is never alone. Don't get into this whole thing of who's better and worse in army, more liberal or more nationalist, more universalist, more particularist. Let's synthesize, let's unite, and let's know that together, the power of community Never Alone.
Let me ask you, and by the way, one thing I forgot to mention about the book for the audience is I remember not that when we traveled on your Fear No Evil, and I also traveled with you when you organized the 87 March in Washington for Silver Jury. But I remember people come up to you all the time and say you're an inspiration, and you would get tired of that. And I remember I think if I remember correctly, that you would like if someone said, boy, it's a funny book. And I have to say that this book is also funny. Your wit that clearly you've had your whole life remains true in this book, and it's funny. There are a lot of funny lines in here, and it's very enjoyable to read. Let me ask Gil one more question before I ask Nathan the next few, if I may. Just the historian in me wants to know. There are a lot of quotes in this book. And here in Washington, we're always Bibi said this, Sharon told Natan this. That's interesting. Mort Zuckerman, who was also a friend of mine, and Jinsa's said that to you. That was interesting, but obviously it's not footnoted. So how did you? I mean, is this all Natan? Your memory is so ironclad, or did you take notes sometimes, or where did these quotes come from exactly?
I do have some notes sent, let's say, by Ariel Sharon at the government meeting when he asked me to vote for his proposal and I refused. But it's not, we are not going to these personal notes which people wanted to keep personal. Usually, let's say it was much easier than Fear No Evil, where I had to retell all the interrogations of KGB. Here, simply, we are speaking about the moments which were really very important for me and for the country, and so very dramatic. As you see, there are no long quotes, but there is one or another phrase which really struck me when Bibi says about some Jews that they really don't like Israel. And they say, how can you say that Israel? No, they like Israel, which is in their head, but not Israel, which has to fight for its existence. And he said it with such bitterness. And on one hand, I disagree with him. On the other hand, I understand why it's so painful. So of course, these phrases then live with you for many days. You're coming back to this. Or my conversations with Ariel Sharon before disengagement, but I disagreed with him strongly, and the arguments which was given. So as you notice, there are no long quotes. There is no there are no speeches. It's all the phrases which really then echoed, and I was coming back to these phrases because they were important for the future development. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike, you've zeroed in on one of my professional anxieties. I don't trust oral history. I like oral history as a way of giving a little emphasis. We should point out that today, November 10th, November 10th is the 45th anniversary of the amazing moment when Daniel Patrick Moynihan got up November 10th, 1975, and turned to the United Nations and said this awful lie that Zionism is racism is a lie that the United States will not acknowledge, will not abide by, will never acquiesce in this infamous act. And I wrote a book about that. And I literally was interviewing a very, very impressive person whose name I won't mention, you'll see why in a second. And he told me that he was in the UN on November 10th, 1975. And after that speech, Daniel Patrick Moynihan stood up, crossed the General Assembly, and hugged Chaim Herzog, who was the Israeli ambassador to the UN, and the two of them walked out together to the closest Irish pub. That embrace occurred 3 weeks earlier. Now, I knew that. And I said to him, I said, that took place 3 weeks earlier. He said, no, you're wrong. And I stopped. I was, it was a Bigfoot. I didn't want to be disrespectful. So I came into this project with a very healthy fear of oral history. And so what did we do? Number one is Natan indeed has an extraordinary memory. I mean, this is someone who was able to play chess in his head for 9 years. And after he played one version of it, he would turn the board around and replay it from the black side or the white side. So we're not talking about somebody who has kind of the soupy brain that so many of us tend to have the older we get. a very, very sharp memory. Secondly, as he says, it was the dramatic moments. And thirdly, what we would do is I would, between our meetings, research and find a Haaretz article, a Ma'ariv article, Jerusalem Post article, either confirming the quote
Yeah.
or at least triggering the atmosphere around so that we could sharpen the quote. And we'll put the whole thing in brackets because, of course, all the conversations were taking place, or almost all the conversations were taking place in Hebrew. And so to the extent that the book is in English and will eventually hopefully be translated into Russian and to Hebrew, but because we're now rendering the conversations in English, that also gives a certain kind of poetic license. So I actually feel quite comfortable, and we went through every fact, every number, every date, and every quotation again and again and again, that this is as authoritative as you can be in a memoir.
Yeah, no, I was curious. It's a challenge-friendly memoir. Okay. By the way, one of the lines, which is I know you have, what's true is one of the funniest lines is in your party. I think it was Ron Dermer you said that helped you with the slogan, current ambassador to Israel, from Israel to Washington, of course, saying we went to prison first. And I thought that's a great line for a slogan for a
No,
political.
we are new type of the party. We
Yeah.
go to prison first.
Right, exactly.
Funny, today is less and less funny, but we have more politicians who go to prison after.
Yes, yes, no, it was very funny. Okay, let me ask you some, I appreciate that, Gil, and not done about that. I was just curious as a storm myself and, just about that. Let me ask you a few questions about, Natan, look, I got a lot of questions, but let me try to limit them to a few. One of the lines you use in the book a lot is doublethink. And you say this is an issue for a challenge for growing up in the Soviet Union, but anyone growing up in an oppressive society, you think one thing, you say another. I was just curious about today, if you don't mind my raising this. I think there's a lot of doublethink going on today in democratic societies, cancel culture, in the time of cancel culture. I'm just curious how you look at modern democratic societies when it comes to double thinking today.
Well, you touched a very important and I'd say painful point. First of all, to remind what we mean when speak about doublethink in the Soviet Union. As I wrote in my other books, and under totalitarian society, there are always three groups of people: true believers, those who believe in the ideology of this society, of official ideology. With the time, there are this group is smaller and smaller and smaller. The dissidents, those few who, in spite of the threat of being arrested or even killed, cross the line and are punished for their views. And the third group, people who don't believe to the official ideology, don't trust to the authorities, but are afraid to speak their mind, and that's why they have a double life. And I was having this double life from the very early age, from the age of 5, and all the way when at the age of 5, Stalin died, and my father explains to me that it is good for us, for Jews, that Stalin died, but don't tell it to anybody, do what everybody does. And I go to kindergarten and I cry together with all the children and sing songs about the great leader, son of all the people, Stalin. And I remember that it's good that he died. And I have no idea how many children are crying really, or how many are crying exactly like me. That is typical life of doublethink. And in the totalitarian society, the more this regime exists, the bigger the group of double thinkers. And then in the end, when double thinkers start crossing the line and becoming dissident, that's when revolution happens. That's all good theory. That was our life under the totalitarian regime. I had no idea, in wildest imagination, I could think that next time that I'll see this doublethink will be in the free world. In fact, it happened in Harvard, from all the places where in 2003, in the time of Second Intifada, when the student or postgraduate of a business school of Harvard explains to me that she wanted very much to sign the letter in support of Israel, but she knew that her 3 professors will not like it, and for her career, they are very important, and she decided until she'll graduate from this business school, she will not be speaking publicly in support of Israel. That was my first encounter with this, not in Moscow University, in America, not under totalitarian regime. What is to be afraid of? Today, it's such a broad phenomenon. I think there is Cato Institute, which made a study recently that like 62% of Americans on the left and the right prefer not to speak publicly about their political views. I believe that is one of the most frightening phenomena in the free world, because the moment this clear criteria or difference between fair society and free society, as we proposed then with the Ron Town Square test, if you go to the center of the city and you can speak freely your mind and you're not afraid to be punished, it means you live in free society. If not, fair society. So today, the fact that it becomes less and less clear, the difference, it's very alarming. And we write a lot about it in our book.
Okay, let me ask you, by the way, just on that, you mentioned Harvard, and I felt that way a bit, but there was a great Russian historian at Harvard. Gil might have known him. I knew him a little before he died. Adam Ulam was actually Jewish, born in Poland. And in his, I think, terrific biography of Stalin, it ends with saying how people cried in the Gulag when Stalin died in 1953. Do you believe that? Because you actually mention it in the book. You refer to it. You know,
Yeah, well,
it was an exchange with Shimon Peres, maybe, or with the Palestinians. And I was just curious how you feel. Is that, you think that's true?
about what? That some people
Really cried. Yeah.
I personally knew some communists who were arrested in 1937, accusing the enemies of the people, spent 16, 17 years in prison until, and were released under Khrushchev after Stalin died, and still believed that communism is a great idea. Stalin simply didn't know how some people behind him turned this great idea into kind of mafia regime, and they continued to believe in it. Of course, there were few, but yes, there were. And there were also, when Stalin died, I was a little boy, but there were people who were crying, and my mother, she remembered this scene in this one of the squares. People listen to the radio, they're crying, and then there is one Jewish woman also crying, and somebody comes to her, slaps her in her face and said, "You Jews killed him, and now you're crying." So you have to understand the complexity of all what was happening. But that was under this awful tyrannical regime with the philosophy of Leninism, Stalinism, Marxism, which of course was extremely inhuman. I believed it's all is dead. We defeated the communism. Communism is behind us. The fact that today there are so many people in the United States, in the free world, who believe that Marxism is a good thing and that it is good to try it again, it's really surprising.
Yeah. Since we're talking about Russia, let me ask you also, and obviously my questions are generally more on foreign policy since this is Jinsa. Let me ask you about Vladimir Putin. And I think when you were, the last time I saw you, which I think was about a year and a half ago, I've talked to you a couple times about him, and I asked you about him. On the one hand, you're obviously a fervent human rights advocate. That's obviously from your time there till today. On the other hand, you have, as a Jew, you have in Vladimir Putin, although it doesn't get a lot of attention, he doesn't generally say or ever say anti-Semitic things. There's been a renaissance of Jewish life in Russia today. A lot of the oligarchs are Jewish. How do you view Putin? Because for a czar, he's pretty sympathetic. He's unusually sympathetic to the Jews, but he's obviously a czar. And I'm curious how you look at Putin and how you think the West, how Israel, how the United States should really deal with him.
Well, Putin was KGB man and is KGB man and thinks in terms of KGB man and divides all the world to the friends, enemies, and those who betrayed you. And the worst, of course, are those who betrayed you. And that's how he sees people, and that's how he sees countries and the world. And in terms of democracy and human rights, he was bad for Russia, no doubt. Having said all this, I have to say, it is maybe first time in the 1,000 years of Russian history that the leader of the state not only doesn't hate Jews, not only is not anti-Semitic, but he has a lot of sympathy to Jews. And he has his personal stories about his childhood, how Jewish neighbors helped him and so on. But you know, everybody has stories. I have to tell you, in the beginning, when he was only became a president, I had a number of meetings with him. In fact, on his initiative, because he wanted through me to give a message to the world, and first of all to America, that the world changed, we have different policy, and we were discussing many things about Iran and others, and he was lying to me. But on one thing, he himself said about Jews, he said, I believe it was a big mistake of the Soviet Union that they decided that independent Jewish life is bad for Soviet Union. In fact, I think it's good for us. The Jewish communities can be a great communicator between us and the West. And I'm going to support Jewish communities. As I say, many things which he was telling me about Iran, about Syria, of course, he was lying, and we should have no doubt. His aim was to turn back Russia into superpower, and he decided that the way to press on America is Iran, and that's what he was doing and continues to do. But what he said me about Jewish communities, he keeps his word, and his attitude to Israel is it is Jewish Russian-speaking state. He really feels that he's coming here. There is a lot of people speaking in Russian. There are newspapers, and also they're Jewish. So it goes together, and we should not fall into illusion that because he is sympathetic to Jews, that's why he will help us with Iran or with Syria. No, his policy in Iran and Syria is very dangerous, and when America is not ready to stop this policy, we have problems. And we have, of course, to rely also on us. But as to keeping connection with Jewish community in Russia, of course, we have to use it and to help the Jews to live full Jewish life.
Yeah. Do you, all right, I might come back more on that. Let me ask you, look, and for those who don't know, you basically had two roles when you were in Russia growing up, or when you came of age. You were a human rights worker for Andrei Sakharov, who you admired a great deal, and you were a Jewish refusenik. Now, one of your themes in the book, and you wrote a whole book on it with Ron Dermer, Case for Democracy, of course, is the importance of democracy. And you mentioned, you write at length, you and Gil, about why one of the reasons you were opposed to the Oslo Accords was you didn't want that Israel should impose a dictatorship on the Palestinians in the form of Yasser Arafat. And so let me ask, you're talking about how really it seems like durable peace could only come with, durable peace could only come with a democratic society. So how do you look at the Abraham Accords, which is a terrific breakthrough for Israel and for US interests, but they're not democratic countries, obviously, so.
Let me say some notes, and then Gil can say a lot because he, as a historian, and also we discussed this topic so many times. Look, nobody says, and I never say that you should never deal with dictators. Some of the most important alliances were the dictators. Churchill and Roosevelt allied with Stalin to fight Hitler. The problem is only when you are under illusion that Stalin will work for you, or Stalin will help you, or Stalin is a real friend, and so on. Every dictator, the aim of the dictator is to keep his own people under control. The leaders of the free world, they depend on their people, as we just now saw in these days. And the dictators don't depend on their people. People depend on them. So they have to keep them under control. And they need external enemy. And at any moment, you can become external enemy for these dictators. And my problem with Oslo was not simply that he is a dictator. Of course, I don't like dictators, but we created him. We brought him and said to Palestinians, he will be our dictator who will be ruling you. And why? Because he will deliver peace. And we said, our leaders said, that because he is a dictator, because he doesn't have restrictions of democracy, he will fight with Hamas and defeat Hamas much easier than we'll do. And that's when I wrote my first article. It was against Oslo. It was 3 weeks after it was signed, that as a dictator, he will do everything, that his people will hate us more in order he can control them. And that's why it is such an illusion to think that he will be working for peace with us. To the contrary, all his power is coming from the fact to continue war with us. So now, but that's why I always saying and speaking that the real peace cannot come from the imposed. It has to come from bottom up. Mm-hmm. There must be civil society among Palestinians with which we will be dealing with. What's so good about Abraham Accords? Of course, they are not democracy. Of course, they are probably dictators, or at least autocratic regimes. But look, the peace is coming from bottom up. Until now, we don't have with Egypt and with Jordan, not a one businessman, not a one actor who's ready to come and to deal with us, because public opinion is absolutely against, it's hostile. Here, before we sign any agreements, there is a lot of businessmen want joint ventures. Actors are learning Hebrew in order to give concerts. Film studios are discussing joint ventures. Tourists, millions of tourists want to visit from Israel, Abu Dhabi, and vice versa. So it's very different type of agreement, and we don't have to put our existence in the hands of these regimes. We are now normalizing our relations. I really hope that is a new beginning. Gil, you want to add something?
If Israel waits for every country around it to turn democratic before starting a peace deal, it's going to have to wait a very, very long time. And there's a kind of hypocrisy on the part of the Oslo enthusiasts, because one of their mantras was you have to make peace with an enemy. And all of a sudden, when let's put the cards on the table, when Donald Trump has his fingerprints on the Abraham Accords, many of these same people say, oh, wait a minute, how can you be making peace with a dictator? And the key is, I think, the word that Natan used a number of times, which is no illusions. We know that underlying this beautiful bottom-up celebration, and it really is a celebration. I can't tell you how excited people are in Israel. Now they're talking about soon there are going to be 100 flights every week back and forth. I mean, it's unbelievable how excited people are during this very difficult time. But we all know at the end of the day, it's Iran, Iran, Iran. We know that what really united the Gulf states with Israel, and Saudi Arabia, of course, is playing a key role in the background, is a fear of Iran. And that's okay, because the enemy is my friend. So if we have a peace where we're sensitive, where we're sober, where we're open to the realities of it, that's very important. So that's the first point. Let me add two other points. Second, when we talk about what goes on in the universities, how can it be that these people who are supposedly so progressive and so for peace support the Palestinian leadership's boycott of Israel and the Palestinian attack on normalization? We've seen the beauty of normalization here. We've seen the power of normalization. And who really is the ultimate people who suffer when there's no normalization? It's the lovely left-wing people who want to have a cultural exchange with their Palestinian brothers and sisters. It's the lovely people who want to sort of reach out, who are told that, no, that makes you an enemy of the Palestinian people. And so we have to use the Abraham Accords to call out the hypocrisy of the far left and say, if you really believe in peace now, don't you think peace is this kind of thing where the more opportunities you have for peace, the better, the more context? And now we're seeing just a few hours ago, the Knesset voted on the agreement with Bahrain. It's extraordinary. And one last thought, if I may, let's be honest. There's some nervousness in Israel because indeed, if all too often when there's an exchange of regimes, when the new guy comes in, they define their foreign policy as not being the previous administration's foreign policy, that's scary. And we really hope that the Joe Biden administration comes in and learns some of the lessons from Donald Trump's administration, even as it repudiates so many other things in Trump's administration. Democrats have to be honest. If Hillary Clinton had been president, there probably wouldn't be an Abraham Accord. And if Hillary Clinton had been president, the embassy probably still would be in Tel Aviv, not in Jerusalem. And so it's not only about not unringing that bell, but what can you learn about thinking out of the box? What were the kind of false assumptions of the peace processors, of the Oslo worshipers that kept them stuck? And how did Donald Trump, in all his insanity, if I may, think out of the box enough that we had a tremendous breakthrough?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. By the way, Nathan, you mentioned Churchill, of course, so that's it's an opportunity for me to plug my own book from a while ago.
Yeah, right.
And he does say in 1941, I will not unsay anything he said about, communism and Soviet Union. He was one of the leading anti-communists, except for him, unlike Halifax and Chamberlain, he wasn't blinded strategically by his anti-communism, and he was able to prioritize, unlike them, I think.
Yeah. But also he was the first who understood that now that after Hitler, now our enemy becomes really Soviet Union.
That's right.
He explained to the world that now we are in the Cold War and not in the continuation of our great alliance. He understood the nature of communism. Yeah.
The Iron Curtain falling down on.
Absolutely. All right, let me ask you one other, and I have a lot more questions. I wish we had a lot more time, but before I ask one more question, Harris, do you want to remind people how they could ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely. You can type a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Again, in the Q&A box, you can type a question or raise your hand. Thanks.
Let me ask you another question that somewhat related, not done. Look, it's clear in your book, you're in Gil's book, that you have a lot of respect and admiration for Ronald Reagan, that his words about evil empire really lifted your spirits and those political prisoners in the Gulag. And then you met him and you said that he was, in person, he was like you hoped he would be, in a very positive way. And you admire Scoop Jackson. In fact, GINSA was founded in 1976 and we have a Scoop Jackson Award. That's our highest award. We give it at our dinner. So you're very, especially, you write about the importance of connecting human rights to foreign policy. Given the complexities, let's set Israel aside for a second. I'll ask you, how would you like to see the United States today make those linkages?
Well, look, let's be frank. The last two presidents, President Obama and President Trump, it seems like two different worlds. They both disconnected fully the foreign policy from the question of freedom and democracy. And President Obama, who was speaking about engagement with every regime, and when there was the Iranian Revolution, when millions of Iranian people decided that they want to change the regime, the leader of the free world said that engagement with the regime is more important than replacing of the regime. If President Bush met with more than 100 democratic dissidents from different countries, allies and not allies, Obama stopped this practice. Then comes President Trump, and he meets with North Korean dictator, and he says that he loves his people and his people love him. To show bigger not understanding of the dynamics between people and dictator. So I believe that the fact that America stopped its noble policy of supporting democratic dictators democratic dissidents, of speaking about their plight, of connecting practically every official visit to Soviet Union, senators and congressmen and presidents, beginning with putting the names of democratic dissidents in prison, of Soviet Jews, freedom of immigration, legislation of Senator Jackson. These were very important steps on defeating or winning the Cold War. There is a lot of conversation, for example, in the last years about the need to challenge China.
Yes.
But practically, what steps America did practically on the legislative level, on administrative level, on even public level, representatives of human rights organizations, what they did really to draw attention to the fight of millions of Muslims who are persecuted, or the Tibetans whose culture is erased, and democratic dissidents who are dying in prisons. Look, America can do a lot to have the, I don't say that you can impose democracy. You cannot impose, those who think that you can come with your army to impose on somebody democracy, it's impossible. But to see that your real allies are democratic dissidents, and to make their role more important, and to put it high on the international agenda, for sure, America on every level, public opinion in America, and presidents and senators can do much more.
It's a mistake to always look at values and interests as being in contradiction when you're talking about the foreign policy of a democracy like the United States of America, when you're talking about the foreign policy of a country which, from its founding, wanted to be the beacon of the world. And look, if we go to one of the best speeches in American history, which is George Washington's farewell address, on the one hand, he does call for isolationism, but in the very call for isolationism, he also calls for a kind of idealism and holding high our values. And I think our new president has to come in to look at every single country in the world. And first of all, it's not only, as Natan says, understanding that we have a moral obligation to help democratic dissidents and support them, but also look how much damage we did to the Soviet Union as Americans by supporting the democratic dissident movement there. So it's also in our best interest. But it's not only about supporting dissidents, it's also about supporting democracies like the State of Israel. When we talk about Israel, we talk about the shared values and the shared interests, and that being like a strong rope, two intertwined connections rather than just a thin strand. And yes, when we try figuring out how do we stand up to Syria, to Russia, to China, some of which are stronger, to Iran, the fact that those countries disrespect their people, don't have the same democratic values, must be front and center. And it can actually make us stronger and more shrewd in our use of power.
Yeah, I'll mention, Joe Biden had an op-ed on CNN, I guess it was last month, and it was an unfortunate coincidence that the day before that Iranian wrestler, I think Afkari, was executed. I think that was on a Saturday, and his op-ed appeared on a Sunday, and he kind of cited it. I mean, we know that, when you're presidential candidate, someone else writes these things, but that same op-ed refers to it and then also talks about getting back in the Iran deal. And it'll be interesting to see how Joe Biden navigates these concerns after he's criticized Trump for coddling dictators. Harris, I have more questions, but I'll hold off. And you want to share some from the audience? Harris? Okay. I know Harris is having some internet issues. He texted me that he was frozen a little bit. We'll have to, Harris? Okay. We'll have to check on his Wi-Fi at his home. Then until Harris comes back, let me ask another question, because actually, this is actually a segue. Well, since we're talking about Joe Biden and the U.S. election, which was last week, of course, he hasn't been officially confirmed as president, but the press has certainly cited him as such. But assuming he's president, which it looks likely he is, how would you, what advice would you give to him about dealing with Israel in the Middle East now? What would be, I know that's a broad question, but if you had a few minutes with him, what would be the focus you would?
Okay, Gil.
Yeah, you're gonna.
Okay, as I said, the first thing I would say is really try to put your assumptions aside, not your values aside, but your assumptions, and try to learn from some of the successes of the Trump administration with Jerusalem and with and with the Abraham Accords. That's number one. Number two, Iran.
Yeah.
I think the real challenge for Joe Biden's foreign policy will be how he handles Iran, and let's divide the Iranian issue into at least two, and we try to do this in the book. One is the question of the JCPOA and the agreement about the nuclear, the rush to go nuclear, and what is the most, and first of all, in a country that's badly divided, let's first articulate what we all agree on. We all agree that we don't want a nuclear Iran. So we can actually lower the rhetorical temperature by saying, okay, if that's our goal, then we're actually just having a tactical debate about what's best, right? So we've already kind of changed the dynamic in the conversation. So I think, I hope that Bibi Netanyahu delivers Joe Biden a Christmas present filled with all the goodies that he got from all the raids that the Mossad has done on Iranian intelligence offices, and shows just how problematic the deal was, because the Iranians weren't paying attention. And I think Joe Biden has to go in with a much more realistic assessment of what commitments the Iranians were fulfilling before Donald Trump froze the deal. That's one part of it. But the second part is that right now, there are already analyses coming out of Israel that say that Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which got millions of dollars pumped into their coffers when the deal went through, because there were tens of millions of dollars that went from the United States to Iran, from Iran to these awful actors, they're chomping at the bit. Because again, love Trump or hate Trump, because he put economic sanctions on Iran, that spigot has been turned off. And again, that's a good way of starting with something on which we agree. I don't think there are any Americans who want money going to these bloodthirsty terrorists.
Yeah.
And let's make sure that the United States of America, once again, doesn't fall into the mistake of facilitating the spread of that money and thus that violence. And that also is a way of kind of saying to Joe Biden, you know what? Put the assumptions aside. Let's go with open eyes. It's not about Trump or Biden. It's not about Republicans or Democrats. It's about what's best for the American people.
Yeah. So let me.
Okay, let me.
Oh, please. Yeah.
Let me add something. First of all, I have to say that all the years that I was coming to America after my release, so I think Biden was in the Senate already from the NOA. And I met him many times, and I listened to him on his meetings with Jewish communities when he was a vice president, I don't know, dozens of times. He is very friendly to Israel.
Right.
Even more that it is now it is so popular to speak about deep distrust between Bibi and Democratic parties. I think Biden and Bibi had great chemistry. And well, Biden correctly was saying that we disagree on many things, but I love you, Bibi.
Right.
I'm not concerned about this, whether there'll be chemistry or not. But Biden, with his very positive attitude to Israel, to Jewish people, he was vice president in the administration, which made some awful mistakes vis-a-vis Syria and Iran. The fact that they put red lines with Syria about chemical weapons and then didn't do anything, that what gave to Russia green light to come and to create military base. And whatever will be the, as I said once to Bibi, I don't know whether Syria will exist in 20 years, but Russian military base will exist. And it changes everything. And it all started from the fact that America demonstrated that it doesn't want to lead, it doesn't want to influence, it doesn't want to interfere, even when Syria is crossing the red lines, which American president put them. And with Iran, I believe that the biggest unfortunate thing of America was that in any stage of the negotiations, President Obama was not ready to link the agreement with the continuation of terrorist activity by Iran. And I wrote articles about it at the time of negotiations. We write about it in the book, how it can be that with Soviet Union, if Soviet Union was making anything aggressive towards America, it immediately influenced on all the negotiations. Here, Iran continues speaking about America's big side and Israel small side should be erased. And you're making agreement refusing to make any linkage. Hundreds of millions of dollars went straight to Hezbollah immediately after signing agreement. And most of this were brought by cash from America to Iran. So I hope we learned something and America learned something. And I hope that President Biden, now as a president, will continue, or he wants to go to the agreement with Iran, he will be wise enough, using all his experience of dozens of years, beginning from Soviet Union, will know to link these agreements with the terrorist activity of Iran.
Let me ask you something on a personal note, Natan. You in the book, look, you know, you grew up as a dissident, as an activist, writing, signing petitions, demonstrations, rallies, and you talk about in 1987 how you had to deal with the establishment, and that was important, you know, and that Avital, your wife, told you you have to work with them, but they're going to take credit, which you said they did. I remember when we traveled then, we went to one city, and I remember the Jewish Federation, they were raising money with your presence, not for the rally in Washington, but for their own federation. So we got out of there quickly, I remember that. How do you, maybe you could just explain your adjustment from becoming an activist, a dissident, to then you went into Israeli politics, you headed a major organization in the Jewish Agency, and how you, I guess it seems like you've always kept that activist core inside you despite those changes.
No, that's a good question. By the way, we also deal with this a lot in the book. How you're dealing with different organizations which don't agree with one another, which accuse one another in some very bad things, which don't cooperate in any way, and at the same time, they're working for the same cause. It happened so that I was activist and like spokesman, an official spokesman of our movement. And so I discovered very quickly there are so many Jewish organizations who are fighting for our cause. Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, and Council for Soviet Jewry, and Conference for Soviet Jewry, and Coalition for Soviet Jewry. And they don't like one another. And sometimes you have to take risk and to smuggle the same document, appeal of dissidents to Senator Jackson, for example, to two different organizations which are on the adjacent streets in Manhattan, but they will not cooperate. And but soon you understand that after all, it is good that there are so many different organizations because it gives the opportunity to reach very different groups. And after all, when it came to KGB, when you are arrested, all these groups are on the same file of anti-Soviet organizations. And for KGB, they don't understand it's the difference. They understand that it's all one movement against them, and they're right. So the thing is how to reach this cooperation. And here, the advice which my wife gave me when I came out of prison was that there is establishment and there are activists. That without activists, establishment will not do anything. But without establishment, nothing will happen. There will be demonstrations here or there. And so you really have to know how to mobilize activists. They will be very happy to to irritate establishment. The establishment will in the end will be mobilized, will do things, and then will take credit. The moment they take credit, you know you have won. And that's exactly what happened with organizing our demonstration in Washington. We were, you remember, we went from one university to the other. We were speaking with the students about the importance of the demonstration. And the establishment was afraid it didn't want. But then when the enthusiasm of the students or the activists was so big, and it became clear that it is possible that hundreds of thousands of people will come to Washington when Gorbachev will come. So establishment was mobilized. They gave a lot of money. They rented all the airplanes, I think, of that day, which 250,000 people were brought this very difficult logistical operation to Washington. It was the biggest demonstration in Washington. The message was clear. President Reagan used this demonstration to President Gorbachev. And in fact, then activists and establishment worked together. So that is big secret of our success, how to make everybody to compete, to disagree, but to work for one cause.
From a biographical perspective, what's fascinating, if I could just throw this in, is that in prison and in the movement, Natan Sharansky specialized in one thing with one word, no, right? He brought stubbornness to an art form that we can only imagine. He actually has a great line. He says, you know, it's very easy to be a Jew in prison. All you had to do was say no. Every day you say no, 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 and you've beaten the KGB. So you get out of prison and all of a sudden the Jews have all these rules. You have to pray here, you have to say this, you have to do that. What's fascinating about the other two parts of his career, the other 9 years, is that both in the Israeli government and in the Jewish agency, the same stubbornness is used for bridge building, right? But both of them come from the power of this love of the Jewish people. Both of them come from this commitment to, we use different tactics, but when we're fighting our enemy, we don't compromise. When we're working with our friends, with our fellow neighbors, with American Jews and Israeli Jews, with Americans and Israelis, with fellow Democrats, that's when we compromise. And that's what people miss, that it's the same personality using different personality traits for the higher goal.
If I had to ask you on this, you mentioned in the book, this, you quote, I think you said this KGB colonel immortalized himself by dismissing your supporters as students and housewives. And
bunch of students and housewives, yeah.
And it kind of reminded me a little bit of Stalin's line about, well, at least what he supposedly said. How many tank divisions does a Pope have?
Yeah,
Like that.
the Pope.
How do you see that, you know, this sort of mentality, the dismissive of the people, the power of the masses, you think?
Yeah, well, that's exactly the same phrase that Colonel Volodin, Colonel KGB said. You think they will help you? They were showing some film which they were using against me, but there was a demonstration. He said, look who they are. They're a bunch of students at houses, and we are KGB. You understand what power we are? They felt themselves the most powerful regime in the world. They are planning coups all over the world. They're reaching everybody in any part of the world. They're keeping millions of people under control, and millions are informers working for KGB. And so what this bunch of students and housewives can do to them? But, well, we believed in the power of the freedom, of the power that people want to be free, and the power of Jewish solidarity. And I knew a little bit, being 4 years spokesman and activist of our movement, I knew how strong this feeling is of solidarity and how it gives us opportunity to reach practically all the leaders of the world. And so, yes, I think it is one of the most optimistic stories what happened, that a small group of Jews went back to their identity, rediscovered their identity in the Soviet Union, started fight, and then Jews of America rediscovered their identity by expressing solidarity, and then non-Jews like Senator Jackson supported us. And from this struggle of very small group of people, in the end, Soviet Union was defeated. Of course, for this we needed Margaret Thatcher, and we needed Ronald Reagan. But from where all this started? All this started from this group of students and housewives on both sides of the Iron Curtain who decided that they want to be free and they want to help the others to be free. So we should always remember the real power of our people.
I think that's a great I have more, but I think we've taken up too much of your time, and that's a great optimistic note to conclude. Harris, are you unfrozen?
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Okay. So if I may,
Welcome back.
I want to thank Gil, and I want to thank Nathan for your time. And I want to thank everybody who joined. And it's really a terrific book. And I learned a lot about a lot of things. So I encourage everybody to read it. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you,
Mike.
Michael. It's great to be with you.
everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.